Hey there, and welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new, hit that subscribe button for spine-tingling Reddit creepypasta stories that are perfect for a night of chilling thrills. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and let's get into tonight's stories. I bought magic rock from the dark web and played the Ouija board, trying to get my dead sister back. The next night, she was standing with black eyes in front of the mirror. Hey Reddit, I need to get this off my chest. I know it sounds insane, but I'm not making any of this up. I'm still shaking while typing this. Last month, I hit rock bottom. My little sister, Emily, passed away in a car accident a year ago, and it shattered my family. She was only 15. We were super close, and I just couldn't cope with her being gone. My parents tried to move on, but I was stuck. Every night I saw her face in my dreams, heard her laugh, and it was driving me crazy. I needed to do something, anything, to feel close to her again. I started dabbling in the dark web out of desperation. Yeah, I know, stupid move. But grief does weird things to you. I came across this weird forum where people were talking about all kinds of supernatural shit. One guy was selling what he called a soul stone. He claimed it could connect you with the dead. It sounded like bullshit, but I was desperate. I paid $500 in Bitcoin and waited. A week later, a small package arrived. It was a simple black rock, about the size of my palm, smooth and cold. There was a note inside: use wisely, the veil is thin. That night, I did what the guy said. I drew a circle on the floor, lit some candles, and held the stone while thinking about Emily. Nothing happened at first. I felt like an idiot, sitting there in the dark, clutching a rock. But then the air got cold, really cold. My breath came out in white puffs, and I swear I heard whispering, but I couldn't make out the words. I remembered I had an old Ouija board in the attic from a Halloween party years ago. I figured, why not? I set it up in the circle, my fingers trembling. I placed the planchette on the board and asked, Emily, are you there? The planchette didn't move. I felt a crushing disappointment. I was about to give up when it jerked under my fingers. Slowly, it moved to yes. My heart pounded. Is it really you? I asked. Yes. I couldn't believe it. I felt a rush of emotions, relief, joy, fear. Emily, can you come back to me? I whispered. The planchette moved, but this time it was slower, like it was reluctant. It spelled out no. Why not? I demanded. Danger. What danger? I asked, but the planchette stopped moving. I tried to get more answers, but it was like she'd gone silent. I didn't sleep at all that night. My mind was racing. The next day, I noticed weird things around the house. Objects moved, lights flickered, and there was a constant feeling of being watched, but I didn't care. I thought maybe it was Emily trying to reach out. That night, I tried again. This time, the planchette moved more easily, like she was getting stronger. I begged her to come back. Please, Emily, I need you. I can't go on without you. The planchette moved to yes. I felt a surge of hope. The next day, I woke up feeling like shit. I hadn't eaten or slept properly in days. I looked like a ghost, but I didn't care. All I could think about was Emily. I went to the bathroom and splashed water on my face. When I looked up at the mirror, I nearly screamed. There was a shadow behind me, faint, but definitely there. It was gone in a blink, but I knew I saw it. I backed out of the bathroom, my heart racing. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. That night, I decided to try one last time. I set up the circle, lit the candles, and held the stone. This time, I didn't use the Ouija board. I just sat there, talking to her. I told her how much I missed her, how much I needed her. I begged her to come back. The temperature dropped again, and the whispers started. But this time, they were louder. I could almost make out words, but they were jumbled and confusing. I closed my eyes, focusing on Emily. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, like a door slamming shut. I jumped up, my heart in my throat. The candles went out, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight. The circle was smudged, and the rock was gone. I felt a cold breeze, and the whispers turned into a low, guttural growl. I backed up against the wall, my mind racing. What had I done? I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway. "Emily!" I called out, my voice trembling. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a cold, raspy voice whispered, "Not Emily." I bolted. I ran out of the house, not stopping until I was a few blocks away. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in a 24-hour diner, trying to make sense of what had happened. I wanted to believe it was just a nightmare, but it felt too real. The next day, I went back home, exhausted and scared. The house felt different, darker. I didn't dare try the Ouija board again. I just wanted to forget about the whole thing. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. I hadn't dared turn off the lights. I was about to drift off when I heard it, the sound of whispering coming from the hallway. I sat up, my heart pounding. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. I crept towards the hallway, the whispers getting louder with each step. I reached the bathroom and stopped. The door was slightly ajar, and the whispers were coming from inside. I pushed the door open and shone the light inside. The room was empty, but the mirror was fogged up, like someone had taken a hot shower. I stepped closer, and my blood ran cold. Written in the fog, in shaky letters, was a single word: "Help!" My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely hold the phone. I backed out of the bathroom, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do. I just wanted it to stop. I went back to my room and sat on the bed, trying to calm down. But the whispers followed me. They were all around me, growing louder and louder. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The whispers turned into screams, and I felt a crushing pressure on my chest. I don't remember passing out, but when I woke up, it was morning. The house was quiet, but I felt a lingering sense of dread. I stumbled to the bathroom, feeling like I was in a daze. When I looked in the mirror, I nearly screamed. My eyes were bloodshot, and there were dark circles under them. But that wasn't the worst part. Behind me, in the mirror, was Emily. She was standing there, her eyes black as coal. Her face was pale, almost translucent. She looked like she was in pain. "Emily?" I whispered, turning around. But she was gone. I looked back at the mirror, and there she was, staring at me with those black eyes. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and I screamed. And that's when everything went black. When I came to, I was lying on the bathroom floor. The mirror was shattered, and there was blood everywhere. My blood. I had cuts all over my arms and face, but I couldn't remember how I got them. I stumbled out of the bathroom, my head spinning. I needed to get out of the house. I grabbed my keys and ran out the door, not stopping until I was in my car. I drove aimlessly for hours, trying to make sense of what had happened. But no matter how far I drove, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was following me, watching me. And now, as I sit here typing this, I can't shake the feeling that she's still with me, that she's always watching. I don't know what I unleashed, but I know it wasn't Emily, and I don't know how to stop it. Please, if anyone has any advice, I'm desperate. I just want my life back. I ended up crashing at my friend Mike's place. Mike's the kind of guy who never judges, just lets you crash on his couch and offers you a beer. I hadn't told him the whole story, just said I was going through some stuff. We sat in his living room, the TV on but muted. The only sound, the occasional sizzle of a car passing on the wet street outside. I couldn't get that image of Emily out of my head, those black eyes, her ghostly face in the mirror. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her standing there, staring at me with that haunting gaze. I barely slept, and when I did, it was a restless, uneasy sleep, filled with nightmares. The next day, I knew I had to figure out what was happening. I spent hours on the internet, diving into forums about the paranormal, dark magic, and Ouija boards. Most of it seemed like nonsense, but some posts sent chills down my spine. People talked about summoning spirits that weren't who they claimed to be, about entities that could mimic loved ones to get close to you. They called them shadow beings or dark entities. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I brought back wasn't Emily. But how could I tell my parents that? They were already devastated by her death. I didn't want to drag them into this nightmare. I decided to visit an old bookstore downtown that specialized in the occult. It was a small, dusty place run by an old woman named Agatha. She had a reputation for knowing about the darker side of things. When I walked in, the air was thick with the smell of old paper and incense. Agatha looked up from behind the counter, her eyes sharp and piercing. "You look like a man with a heavy burden," she said, her voice raspy. I nodded and told her everything about Emily, the dark web, the soul stone, the Ouija board, and the shadow in the mirror. She listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious with each detail. "You've opened a door that shouldn't be opened," she said finally, "and something has come through." I felt a lump in my throat. "How do I close it?" She shook her head. "It's not that simple. Dark entities are drawn to pain and desperation. They feed on it. You called out to your sister, and it answered. Now it has a hold on you." "What can I do?" I asked, my voice trembling. Agatha reached under the counter and pulled out an old, leather-bound book. "This might help," she said, handing it to me. "It's a grimoire. It has rituals for banishing spirits and closing portals. But be warned, these rituals are not to be taken lightly. One wrong step, and you could make things worse." I thanked her and left the shop, clutching the book like a lifeline. Back at Mike's place, I pored over the pages, trying to make sense of the archaic language and complex rituals. Most of it was beyond my comprehension, but one ritual stood out. A banishing spell that required a personal item of the deceased, the soul stone, and a blood offering. I didn't like the sound of a blood offering, but I was desperate. I needed something that belonged to Emily. Her room at my parents' house had been left untouched since she died. It was painful to think about going in there, but I had no choice. That night, I waited until my parents were asleep and snuck into Emily's room. The air was heavy with dust and memories. Her bed was neatly made, her posters still on the walls. I went to her dresser and found her favourite necklace, a simple silver chain with a heart pendant. I felt a pang of grief as I held it, remembering how she used to wear it every day. Back at Mike's, I set up the ritual in his basement. It was a dingy, unfinished space, but it was the only place I could think of where we wouldn't be disturbed. I drew the circle, placed the soul stone in the centre, and put Emily's necklace next to it. The book said to use a knife for the blood offering, so I grabbed a kitchen knife and made a small cut on my palm, letting a few drops of blood fall onto the stone. The air grew cold immediately, and the shadows in the room seemed to deepen. I started reciting the incantation from the book, my voice shaking. The candles flickered, and the room seemed to darken even more. I kept chanting, my eyes fixed on the soul stone. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the basement, like a door slamming shut. The candles went out, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, but before I could turn it on, I felt a cold hand wrap around my wrist. I screamed and pulled away, scrambling to turn on the light. The flashlight flickered to life, and I saw her, Emily, but it wasn't really her. Her eyes were black, and her face was twisted in a grotesque smile. She stepped towards me, her movements jerky and unnatural. "Why are you doing this?" I cried out, backing away. The thing that looked like Emily tilted its head, its smile widening. "You called me," it said, its voice a distorted echo of my sister's. I stumbled, falling to the ground. The entity loomed over me, its cold eyes boring into mine. I clutched the grimoire, desperately trying to remember the rest of the ritual. My mind was a blur of fear and panic. I forced myself to focus, chanting the final words of the banishing spell. The entity shrieked, a sound that pierced my ears and made my head throb. It reached for me, but as the last words left my lips, it was like an invisible force pulled it back. The room shook, and the shadows swirled around us. The entity screamed again, and then it was gone. I lay there on the cold basement floor, gasping for breath. The air felt lighter, and the oppressive darkness had lifted. I didn't know if the ritual had worked, but the house felt different, quieter. I hoped that meant the entity was gone for good. I cleaned up the basement, hiding any evidence of what had happened. Mike was out with friends and hadn't seen any of it. I didn't want to drag him into this mess. I bandaged my hand and tried to get some sleep, but my dreams were filled with images of Emily and that twisted smile. The next morning, I woke up to a text from my mum. "We need to talk about Emily's room." My heart sank. I hadn't told them anything, but I knew I couldn't keep this a secret any longer. When I got to my parents' house, my mum was waiting for me in the living room. She looked worried, and I noticed she was holding Emily's necklace. "Did you take this?" she asked, her voice trembling. I nodded, my throat dry. "I needed it for something." "I'm sorry, Mum." She shook her head. "It's not just the necklace. There's something wrong with that room. Last night I heard whispers. I thought I was going crazy, but then I saw her." "Who?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Emily," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. She was standing by the window, staring at me with those black eyes. I felt a chill run down my spine. Whatever I'd done, it wasn't over. The entity was still here, and now it had latched onto my family. I had to find a way to end this once and for all. I spent the rest of the day researching more about the entity and how to get rid of it permanently. I found a few references to exorcisms and cleansing rituals, but nothing that seemed strong enough. I needed help, and there was only one person I could think of who might know what to do: Agatha. I returned to the bookstore, clutching the grimoire and Emily's necklace. Agatha looked up as I entered, her eyes narrowing. "I see you've encountered more trouble," she said. I explained everything that had happened since our last meeting, her expression growing graver with each word. When I finished, she sighed and shook her head. "You're dealing with a powerful entity, one that feeds on fear and despair. A simple banishing ritual won't be enough." "Then what do I do?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. She reached under the counter and pulled out a small, ornate box. Inside this box is a talisman. It's an ancient protective charm, but it requires a sacrifice to activate its full power. "What kind of sacrifice?" I asked, dreading the answer. "Your blood," she said bluntly. "A lot of it. The entity has tasted your blood, and it's linked to you. To sever that link, you must offer a part of yourself." I felt a lump in my throat. "How much blood are we talking about?" "Enough to weaken you, but it won't kill you," she assured me. "You need to perform the ritual in the place where the entity first appeared. In your case, that would be your home." I took the box and thanked her, feeling a mix of fear and hope. I knew this was my last chance to end this nightmare. I had to do it, no matter the cost. That night, I went back to my parents' house. They were staying with relatives, too scared to stay in the house after what they'd experienced. I set up the ritual in Emily's room, lighting candles and drawing the protective circle as instructed. I placed the talisman in the center and took a deep breath. Using the same knife from before, I made a deeper cut on my palm, letting the blood drip onto the talisman. The air grew cold, and the shadows in the room seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. I began chanting the incantation Agatha had given me, my voice shaking. The talisman glowed faintly, absorbing the blood. The shadows recoiled, and I felt a presence in the room, a dark, oppressive force that pressed down on me. I kept chanting, forcing myself to stay focused. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, and the candles flickered violently. The air was filled with a low, guttural growl. I looked up and saw the entity, its form shifting and writhing, standing at the edge of the circle. "You cannot banish me," it hissed, its voice a distorted echo. I ignored it and continued chanting, pouring more of my blood onto the talisman. The entity screamed, a sound that made my ears ring and my vision blur. It lunged at me, but the protective circle held, forcing it back. The talisman glowed brighter, and the entity shrieked in agony. I felt a surge of hope, knowing the ritual was working. I pushed through the pain and fear, chanting the final words with all my strength. There was a blinding flash of light, and the entity let out one last, ear-piercing scream. The shadows exploded outward, and then everything went silent. I collapsed to the floor, my vision darkening. The last thing I saw before I passed out was the talisman, now dull and lifeless, lying in a pool of my blood. When I woke up, the room was filled with sunlight. The oppressive darkness was gone and the air felt clean and fresh. I knew the entity was gone, banished back to whatever hell it had come from. I cleaned up the room, wiping away the blood and packing up the ritual items. My parents returned later that day, and I told them everything. They were shocked and scared, but grateful that the nightmare was over. It took time, but we started to heal. Emily was gone, and nothing could change that. But the darkness that had haunted us was finally gone. I still carry the scars from that night, both physical and emotional, but I've learned to live with them. As for the soul stone, I buried it deep in the woods, hoping no one else would ever find it. I've stayed away from the dark web and anything remotely supernatural. Some doors are better left closed. And now, as I sit here writing this, I feel a sense of closure. I've faced my demons and survived, but I'll never forget the look in those black eyes, or the terror of that final night. Some things stay with you forever. The nightmare should have ended there, but it didn't. A few weeks passed, and I started to feel like myself again. I even managed to sleep through the night without waking up in a cold sweat. My parents seemed to be recovering too. Life was slowly returning to normal, but then the dreams started. They began as flashes, images of Emily, her black eyes staring at me from the darkness. In the dreams, she would whisper my name, her voice a haunting echo. At first, I dismissed them as remnants of my trauma, just my mind playing tricks on me. But then, they became more vivid. One night, I dreamed I was back in Emily's room. She was sitting on the edge of her bed, her face pale and eyes black as coal. She looked at me with a mix of sorrow and anger. "You shouldn't have done it," she whispered. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. I tried to shake off the dream, but it lingered. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. I started avoiding sleep, afraid of what I might see. I was running on fumes, my mind a foggy mess. One evening, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the streets. I wandered aimlessly, my thoughts a jumble of fear and confusion. I ended up near the woods where I had buried the soul stone. I hadn't planned on going there, but my feet seemed to have a mind of their own. The trees loomed tall and menacing, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. I felt a chill run down my spine as I approached the spot where I had buried the stone. I stood there, staring at the ground, feeling a sense of unease. It was like the earth itself was holding its breath. I turned to leave, but something caught my eye. A small black stone was lying on the ground, half buried in the dirt. My heart skipped a beat. It looked exactly like the soul stone, but I had buried it deep. How could it have resurfaced? Against my better judgment, I picked it up. It felt cold and heavy in my hand, just like before. A sense of dread washed over me, but I couldn't let it go. I shoved it into my pocket and hurried back home, my mind racing with possibilities. That night, I sat in my room, staring at the stone. I knew I should get rid of it, but something held me back. It was like it had a hold on me, drawing me in. I decided to do some research, hoping to find answers. I scoured forums and websites, looking for any information about the soul stone or similar objects. I stumbled upon a thread discussing cursed objects and their origins. One post caught my attention. It described a ritual to bind a spirit to a physical object, creating a conduit between the living and the dead. The process was dangerous and often resulted in unintended consequences. The description matched the soul stone perfectly. As I read further, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from an unknown number. "You shouldn't have taken it," the message read. My blood ran cold. I looked around my room, feeling like I was being watched. I tried to ignore the message, but another one came through. "It's not over. She's still here." My hands were shaking as I typed back, "Who is this?" No response. I put the phone down, my mind spinning. I didn't know what to believe. Was it just a sick prank, or was there something more sinister at play? The dreams, the stone, the messages. It was all connected, but I couldn't see how. The following days were a blur. The dreams grew more intense, each one more vivid than the last. Emily's black eyes haunted me, her whispers turning into screams. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. My parents noticed the change in me, but I couldn't tell them the truth. They'd think I was losing my mind. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside my room. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it towards the door. The light flickered and died. I cursed under my breath, fumbling to turn it back on. When the light came back, Emily was standing in the doorway. Her eyes were black, her face twisted in a grotesque smile. "You can't escape," she whispered. "You brought me back." I screamed and lunged for the light switch, flooding the room with light. She was gone. My parents burst in, panic in their eyes. "What happened?" my mum asked, her voice trembling. I couldn't explain. I just shook my head, trying to calm down. They sat with me until I fell asleep, but I could tell they were scared. They didn't know what was happening, and neither did I. The next day, I decided to confront Agatha again. She was my only hope of finding a solution. I walked into the bookstore, the bell above the door jingling. Agatha looked up, her eyes narrowing when she saw me. "You're back," she said, her voice filled with concern. I placed the soul stone on the counter. "It came back," I said, my voice barely a whisper. She frowned, examining the stone. "This shouldn't be possible," she muttered. "The entity must have a stronger hold than we thought." "What do I do?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. Agatha sighed. "We need to perform a severing ritual. It's dangerous, and it will require great sacrifice. Are you willing to do whatever it takes?" I nodded. "I don't have a choice. I need to end this." She nodded and handed me a list of items to gather for the ritual. Some of them were rare and expensive, but I didn't care. I would do whatever it took to stop this nightmare. The ritual needed to be performed at the site where the stone had resurfaced, the woods. I gathered the items, feeling a sense of dread with each step. Agatha warned me that the ritual would draw the entity out, and it would fight back. I needed to be prepared for a battle. That night, I returned to the woods, the soul stone and ritual items in my backpack. The air was thick with anticipation, the trees casting long, ominous shadows. I found the spot and set up the ritual, drawing a protective circle and placing the items in the center. I began chanting the incantation, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at my insides. The air grew cold, and the shadows seemed to come alive, swirling around me. I continued chanting, pouring all my energy into the ritual. The soul stone glowed faintly, and I felt a presence behind me. I turned, and there she was, Emily, her black eyes burning with rage. "You can't get rid of me," she hissed, stepping closer. I held my ground, continuing the chant. The talisman in the center of the circle glowed brighter, and the shadows recoiled. Emily screamed, a sound that echoed through the woods, making my ears ring. She lunged at me, but the protective circle held, forcing her back. I kept chanting, my voice growing louder, more confident. The entity's form wavered, and I saw a glimpse of the real Emily, her eyes pleading with me. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I have to do this." The talisman glowed with a blinding light, and the entity let out one final ear-piercing scream. The shadows exploded outward, and then everything went silent. I collapsed to the ground, exhausted and shaking. The air felt lighter, the oppressive darkness gone. I knew the ritual had worked, but the cost was heavy. I had severed the link, but at the expense of any chance of truly connecting with Emily again. As I gathered the items and made my way back home, I felt a mix of relief and sorrow. The nightmare was over, but the scars would remain. I would never forget the haunting black eyes or the twisted smile that had plagued my dreams. The next morning, I buried the soul stone deep in the woods, marking the spot with a simple cross. I said a final goodbye to Emily, hoping she had found peace. I returned home, feeling a sense of closure. The darkness had been banished, and life could finally move on. But the memory of those black eyes would stay with me forever, a reminder of the price of meddling with forces beyond our understanding. As I write this, I hope my story serves as a warning. Some doors are meant to stay closed, and some losses must be accepted. I've learned that the hard way, and I hope no one else has to go through the same nightmare. Life after the ritual wasn't the same. I tried to convince myself that the nightmare was over, but something always felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, a persistent unease that clung to me no matter where I was. It started with small things, lights flickering, shadows darting just out of sight. I'd hear whispers late at night, but when I got up to investigate, there was nothing. I chalked it up to lingering paranoia, remnants of the trauma I'd been through. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. One night, I was in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. My room was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside my window. I heard a soft, creaking sound, like someone walking down the hallway. I sat up, holding my breath, straining to hear. The creaking stopped outside my door. My heart pounded in my chest as I waited, every muscle tense. Slowly, the door began to open. My breath caught in my throat as I saw a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. It was too dark to see clearly, but I knew it wasn't my parents. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice shaking. The figure stepped into the room, and the temperature dropped instantly. I reached for the lamp on my nightstand, but before I could turn it on, the figure spoke. "You shouldn't have buried it," the voice said, cold and hollow. I froze, recognizing the voice. It was Emily's, but distorted, twisted with something darker. I turned on the lamp, flooding the room with light, but the figure was gone. My door was closed, and everything looked normal. I sat there shaking, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was I losing my mind? I needed answers, and there was only one person who might have them. Agatha. The next day, I returned to the bookstore, my hands trembling as I pushed open the door. Agatha looked up, her expression grave. "I had a feeling you'd be back," she said. I told her about the shadowy figure, the voice, the feeling of being watched. She listened intently, her brow furrowing. When I finished, she sighed. "The entity wasn't fully banished. A part of it must have remained tethered to you." "What do I do?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. Agatha stood and walked to a shelf filled with ancient tomes. She pulled out a dusty book and handed it to me. "There is one more ritual. It's dangerous and requires absolute precision. If you make even the slightest mistake, the consequences could be dire." I took the book, feeling a sense of dread. "What kind of consequences?" She met my gaze, her eyes filled with sorrow. "The entity could become permanently bound to you, feeding off your fear and despair until there's nothing left." I swallowed hard, nodding. "I have to try." The ritual needed to be performed at midnight in the place where I first summoned the entity, my parents' house. I gathered the necessary items, each one more obscure and difficult to find than the last. When the night came, I was ready. My parents were out of town, visiting relatives. I had the house to myself. I set up the ritual in the living room, drawing a protective circle and placing the items in the center. The book instructed me to light black candles at each point of the circle, their flames flickering ominously in the dim light. I began the incantation, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at my insides. The air grew cold, and the shadows seemed to come alive, swirling around me. I continued chanting, focusing on the words, each syllable heavy with power. Halfway through the ritual, the candles flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. I felt a cold presence behind me, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I turned slowly, and there she was, Emily, her black eyes gleaming in the dark. "You can't get rid of me," she hissed, her voice a chilling echo. I stepped back, my heart racing. "I have to," I said, my voice trembling. "I need to end this." She stepped closer, her form shifting and writhing in the darkness. "You brought me back. You can't send me away." I continued the incantation, forcing myself to focus. The air grew colder, and the shadows pressed in around me. Emily screamed, a sound that pierced my ears and made my head throb. I pushed through the pain, chanting louder, pouring all my energy into the ritual. The shadows writhed and twisted, and I felt a pressure in my chest, like a vice tightening around my heart. Emily's form flickered, her black eyes burning with rage. "You will never be free," she snarled, her voice distorted and inhuman. I finished the incantation, my voice breaking on the last word. The candles flared to life, their flames burning brighter than before. The shadows recoiled, and Emily let out one final ear-piercing scream. Her form shattered, dissolving into the darkness. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. The air felt lighter, the oppressive presence gone. I knew the ritual had worked, but I felt a lingering sense of unease. Had I truly banished the entity, or had I only driven it deeper into the shadows? As I cleaned up the ritual, I felt a strange sense of calm. The house was quiet, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. I hoped that this was the end, that I could finally move on. But deep down, I knew that some scars never heal. The memory of Emily's black eyes and twisted smile would stay with me forever, a reminder of the dangers of meddling with forces beyond our understanding. As I write this, I can't help but feel a sense of foreboding. The nightmares have stopped, and the house feels normal again. But I can't shake the feeling that something is still watching, waiting in the shadows. I hope I'm wrong. I hope the nightmare is truly over. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that some doors are never truly closed, and some things, once unleashed, can never be fully banished. Life seemed to settle back into a semblance of normalcy after the final ritual. The house was quiet, my dreams were undisturbed, and the oppressive presence that had haunted me felt like a distant memory. I dared to hope that I had finally banished the entity for good. Months passed, and I began to rebuild my life. I reconnected with friends, went back to work, and even started seeing a therapist to deal with the trauma. My parents were supportive, though they remained unaware of the full extent of what had transpired. I wanted to protect them from the horrors I had faced. One night, after a long day at work, I returned home, feeling unusually exhausted. I collapsed onto the couch, flipping through channels on the TV, trying to unwind. The house was quiet, the only sound the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I started to drift off when I heard a soft whisper. "Jack!" I bolted upright, my heart pounding. I looked around the living room, but it was empty. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, a leftover echo of the nightmares. But deep down, I knew better. I turned off the TV and headed to bed, hoping a good night's sleep would clear my mind. As I lay in the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the silence, every creak and groan of the house amplifying my anxiety. Around 3 a.m, I woke up to the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and coming from the hallway. My heart raced as I sat up, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped outside my door, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it towards the door. It was closed, but I could see a faint shadow underneath it, moving slightly. I swallowed hard, trying to muster the courage to get up. I had to know if it was real or just my mind playing tricks on me. Slowly, I crept towards the door, my hands trembling. I reached for the handle and paused, listening. The shadow shifted, and I heard a soft, raspy breath on the other side. I took a deep breath and yanked the door open, shining the light into the hallway. It was empty. The hallway stretched out in both directions, dimly lit by the moonlight filtering through the windows. I stepped out, my heart pounding, and scanned the area. Nothing, just silence. I turned to go back to bed when I saw it. A message, scrawled in what looked like black ash, on the wall across from my bedroom. "You can't escape." I stumbled back, my breath coming in short gasps. The message was fresh, the ash still flaking off the wall. I felt a wave of nausea, my mind racing. I had done everything right, followed every step of the rituals. How could the entity still be here? I knew I had to do something. but I felt utterly powerless. The fear and dread that had subsided returned with a vengeance. I decided to call Agatha one last time, hoping she might have an answer, a solution that I had overlooked. I drove to the bookstore at dawn, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The streets were empty, the city still waking up. When I arrived, the store was closed, but I banged on the door until Agatha appeared, looking tired and concerned. "Jack," she said, opening the door. "What's wrong?" I showed her the picture I had taken of the message. Her expression grew grim as she studied it. "The entity has anchored itself to you. It's feeding on your fear, growing stronger." "What do I do?" I asked, my voice breaking. "I can't keep living like this." Agatha sighed, her eyes filled with sympathy. "There's one final option, but it's extremely dangerous. You have to sever the entity's connection to this world completely. It means confronting it in its realm." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Its realm?" She nodded. "The place between life and death where it dwells. You'll need to enter a deep, meditative state to reach it. It's a perilous journey, and there's no guarantee you'll come back." I felt the weight of her words. The idea of confronting the entity in its own realm terrified me, but I couldn't keep living in fear. I needed to end this once and for all. "How do I do it?" I asked, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at me. Agatha led me to the back of the store, to a small, dimly lit room filled with strange artifacts and candles. She handed me a vial of dark liquid and a small, intricately carved wooden box. "Drink this. It will help you enter the trance. Inside the box is a protective charm. Keep it with you at all times. It will guide you back if you get lost." I nodded, taking the vial and the box. I felt a sense of resolve settling over me. I had to do this, for Emily, for my parents, for myself. Agatha instructed me to lie down on a mat in the centre of the room. She lit the candles and began chanting in a language I didn't recognise. I drank the liquid, feeling its warmth spread through my body. My eyelids grew heavy and the world around me began to blur. I closed my eyes, focusing on Agatha's voice. The chanting grew louder, echoing in my mind. I felt a pulling sensation, like I was being drawn into a deep, dark void. I fought the urge to panic, reminding myself to hold on to the charm. When I opened my eyes, I was in a place that defied description. It was a vast, shadowy expanse, filled with twisted shapes and flickering lights. The air was thick and oppressive, filled with a low, ominous hum. I looked around, clutching the charm tightly. I knew the entity was here, somewhere. I started walking, each step feeling heavy and laboured. The landscape shifted around me, the shadows moving like living things. "Jack!" a voice called out, echoing through the darkness. I turned and saw Emily standing there, her eyes normal, her face filled with sadness. "Emily!" I whispered, taking a step towards her. "Help me, Jack!" she pleaded, reaching out to me. I hesitated, remembering Agatha's warnings. This place was full of tricks and illusions. "How do I know it's really you?" I asked, my voice shaking. Her expression changed, the sadness turning into anger. "You did this to me!" she hissed, her eyes turning black. "You brought me back!" The shadows around her twisted and writhed, forming into the entity's true shape. It was a monstrous, nightmarish figure, all black eyes and sharp teeth. It lunged at me, but I held up the charm, chanting the words Agatha had taught me. The entity screamed, its form flickering and distorting. I felt its power pressing down on me, trying to crush my will, but I kept chanting, pouring all my fear and anger into the words. The charm glowed brightly, and the entity shrieked in pain. The shadows around it began to dissipate, the oppressive weight lifting. I pushed forward, forcing the entity back, driving it away from me. "Begone!" I shouted, the last of the incantation leaving my lips. There was a blinding flash of light, and the entity let out one final agonizing scream. The shadows exploded outward, and I felt myself being pulled back, the world around me dissolving into light. I woke up on the mat, gasping for breath. Agatha was kneeling beside me, her face filled with relief. "You did it," she said softly. "The entity is gone." I felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me, but also a sense of profound relief. The nightmare was finally over. I thanked Agatha, tears streaming down my face. Returning home, I found the house quiet and peaceful. The oppressive presence was gone, and I felt like I could finally breathe again. My parents returned, and I told them that the house had been cleansed, leaving out the more terrifying details. Life gradually returned to normal. The dreams stopped, and the feeling of being watched disappeared. I started to heal, the trauma slowly fading into the background. But I would never forget the lessons I had learned. Some doors are meant to stay closed, some losses must be accepted, and some things, once unleashed, can never be fully banished. As I sit here, writing this final part of my story, I feel a sense of closure. The scars remain, but they no longer define me. I've faced my demons and survived, and now I can finally move on, leaving the darkness behind. I played Ouija board in Chernobyl. The next night, wired things started to happen, and the army evacuated us. We have woken something up we aren't supposed to know. I never believed in ghosts or the supernatural. Hell, I barely believed in anything beyond what I could see and touch. But my friends had this brilliant idea for our trip to Ukraine, a visit to Chernobyl. We were a group of 5 thrill seekers: me, Jake, Alex, Mike, Sarah, and Beth. We'd done the whole urban exploration thing before, but this was different. This was radioactive, forbidden territory, and we were all hyped about the potential danger. Alex, always the instigator, brought a Ouija board along. He thought it'd be funny, you know? "Let's summon some ghosts," he'd said, laughing. We all laughed too. It was all just a joke, a way to add some extra thrill to an already intense trip. We hired a guide to take us through the exclusion zone, paying him extra to let us stay overnight in one of the abandoned buildings. The place was a ghost town, eerily frozen in time. Trees grew through the crumbling remains of buildings, and the silence was thick and heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. Our guide, Ivan, was a grizzled old man who spoke broken English. He warned us about the dangers, both the radiation and the unstable structures, but he didn't care much beyond the money we paid him. After Ivan left, we set up camp in an old school building. The place was creepy as hell. Broken desks, faded posters, and the pervasive smell of decay. It was like stepping into a nightmare. We set up our sleeping bags in what used to be a classroom, and as night fell, the darkness seemed to swallow everything. Alex was eager to get the Ouija board out. I was reluctant, but peer pressure's a bitch. We gathered around, using our phones for light. The flickering screens cast eerie shadows on the peeling walls. Alex placed the board in the middle, and we all put our fingers on the planchette. "Is anyone here with us?" Alex asked in a mocking tone. At first, nothing happened. We exchanged nervous laughs, teasing each other for even considering this nonsense. But then, the planchette moved. I swear none of us pushed it. It spelled out, "Yes." We all froze. My heart pounded in my chest and the air grew cold. Alex, being the fearless idiot he was, pressed on. "What's your name?" The planchette moved again, slowly, deliberately. "MIRA. Where are you?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. The planchette moved to spell out HERE. A chill ran down my spine. The room seemed to grow darker, and I felt like we were being watched. I wanted to stop, but Alex wouldn't let up. He asked more questions, each answer more unsettling than the last. The spirit, Mira, claimed to have died during the disaster, trapped in the school. "Why are you still here?" Mike asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The planchette spelled out a single word, VENGEANCE. We all pulled our hands away at once, breathing heavily. The air was thick with fear, and an oppressive sense of dread settled over us. We tried to laugh it off, but the fear was real. We decided to call it a night, but none of us could sleep. Sometime after midnight, I heard it, a faint scratching sound, like nails on a chalkboard. I sat up, heart racing, and saw shadows moving in the hallway outside our room. I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but then I heard whispering, soft, urgent, incomprehensible. I shook Alex awake, and he saw it too. We grabbed our flashlights and crept towards the door. The hallway was empty, but the whispers continued, growing louder, echoing off the walls. We followed the sound to another room, where the door stood ajar. Inside, it was pitch black, our flashlight beams barely penetrating the darkness. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind us, and the whispers turned into screams, agonized, blood-curdling screams. We bolted back to the classroom, slamming the door shut and barricading it with whatever we could find. Everyone was awake now, and we all sat there terrified, listening to the screams and whispers outside. It felt like hours before the noise stopped, leaving us in an oppressive silence. Just as we thought it was over, a loud bang echoed through the building, followed by heavy footsteps. We all looked at each other, wide-eyed and trembling. The footsteps grew louder, closer, stopping right outside our door. Then, a voice, low, guttural, and dripping with malice, spoke a single word: leave. We didn't need any more convincing. Grabbing our stuff, we fled the building, not caring about the radiation or the dangers outside. We just needed to get away. As we stumbled through the dark, deserted streets of Pripyat, I glanced back and saw a figure standing in the doorway, watching us with glowing eyes. We made it to the checkpoint where Ivan was supposed to pick us up in the morning, but instead of Ivan, we were met by soldiers. They looked grim and hurried us into their vehicles without a word. We were taken to a decontamination facility where they questioned us about what happened. We told them everything, but they didn't seem surprised. In fact, they looked almost scared. That night, as we sat in a sterile room, waiting for the all clear to leave, we heard it again. The whispers, the screams, the low, guttural voice. We had woken something up in Chernobyl, something that should have stayed buried, and now it was coming for us. After that horrifying night in Chernobyl, I thought things would settle down once we got back home. But I was wrong. The military released us after a few days, with stern warnings to never speak of what we experienced. They seemed more concerned about the radiation exposure than the supernatural encounter. We were given thorough medical checkups, decontaminated, and sent on our way. But something had changed. The shadows of Chernobyl followed us back, lingering like a dark cloud over our lives. Back home, the nightmares started. At first, they were just vague, shadowy figures in the periphery of my vision when I closed my eyes. But then, they grew more vivid. I dreamt of Mira, her twisted, burned face staring at me, her eyes full of pain and hatred. She would scream, the sound echoing in my mind long after I woke up in a cold sweat. Alex was the first to crack. He called me one night, his voice shaky and frantic. "Jake, it's happening again. The whispers, they won't stop." I could hear them over the phone, a low, incessant murmur that made my skin crawl. I tried to calm him down, but there was nothing I could say. We all knew something had followed us back. The next morning, I found out Alex was gone. The police said it was an accident, a tragic fall from his apartment balcony, but I knew better. The whispers drove him to it. I told the others, but they didn't want to believe it. They were scared, desperately clinging to the hope that it was all in our heads. Mike was next. He became paranoid, convinced that someone, or something, was watching him. He covered his windows, barricaded his doors, and rarely left his house. When I went to check on him, the place was a mess. Papers and notes were scattered everywhere, filled with frantic scribbles about Mira and the horrors of Chernobyl. He was a wreck, muttering about shadows that moved and voices that spoke to him from the dark. A week later, he vanished without a trace. The police wrote it off as another tragic coincidence. But we knew. We all knew. Sarah and Beth tried to move on, tried to forget, but the nightmares plagued them too. We met up a few times, desperately trying to find a way to end this, to make it stop. but Mira's presence was relentless, an invisible noose tightening around our throats. Sarah started seeing Mira during the day, her ghostly figure lurking in mirrors and reflections, always watching, always waiting. Beth fell into a deep depression. She wouldn't leave her room, barely ate, barely slept. When she finally did sleep, she would wake up screaming, clawing at her own skin as if trying to escape some unseen torment. Her family didn't understand, couldn't understand. They sent her to a psychiatric facility, thinking she had lost her mind. But we knew the truth. Mira was breaking us, one by one. I tried to keep it together, but I was haunted too. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her. I heard the whispers in the dead of night, felt the chill of her presence in my room. I started to see her in the corners of my vision, always just out of reach, always watching. My apartment felt like a prison, the walls closing in, suffocating me with the weight of my fear. One night, as I lay in bed, I felt a cold hand on my ankle. I jolted awake, my heart pounding. There she was, at the foot of my bed, her eyes burning with a hatred so intense it felt like a physical force. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She leaned in, her face inches from mine, and whispered, "You can't escape." The next morning, I knew I had to do something. I reached out to Sarah and Beth, and we decided to meet at a local cafe, a last-ditch effort to find a solution. As I walked there, every shadow seemed alive, every passerby a potential threat. My paranoia was consuming me. At the cafe, we sat in a corner, speaking in hushed tones. Sarah looked pale, her eyes haunted, dark circles under them. Beth was trembling, barely able to hold her coffee cup. We discussed everything, trying to piece together what we knew, what we had done, and how to stop it. But there were no answers, only more questions. As we talked, a sudden cold swept through the room. The lights flickered, and the whispers began, low at first, then growing louder, filling the cafe with an oppressive, suffocating noise. Everyone else seemed oblivious, but we knew she was there. Then, the whispers stopped, a mirror appeared, standing in the middle of the room. No one else seemed to notice her. She pointed at us, her eyes glowing with fury. "You will pay!" she hissed, her voice echoing in our minds. We fled the cafe, stumbling out into the daylight, but the fear stayed with us. We knew we had to end this, but we didn't know how. Mira was relentless, a vengeful spirit who wouldn't rest until we were all broken or dead. That night, I received a message from Ivan, our guide in Chernobyl. He told me he had been experiencing strange things too, and he believed he knew how to stop Mira. Desperate for any solution, I agreed to meet him. We planned to go back to Chernobyl, to the school, and try to put Mira to rest. As I packed my bags for the trip, the shadows in my apartment seemed to grow longer, darker. The whispers were constant now, a maddening background noise that I couldn't escape. I knew this was my last chance. Either we ended it, or Mira would consume us all. Returning to Chernobyl was the last thing I wanted to do, but it seemed like the only way to end this nightmare. Ivan arranged everything, and soon I found myself back in the eerie, desolate streets of Pripyat. Sarah and Beth were with me, both looking more frightened and fragile than ever. The journey was filled with an oppressive silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts, dreading what awaited us. We met Ivan near the same checkpoint where the soldiers had picked us up. He looked older, more haggard, like the weight of what we had unleashed had aged him overnight. He led us back to the school building, the very place where we had made the biggest mistake of our lives. The place looked even more decayed than I remembered. The air was thick with the smell of mold and rot, and every creak of the floorboards under our feet sounded like a scream. Ivan explained that we needed to find Mira's remains and give her a proper burial, something she never received. It sounded simple enough, but we all knew it wouldn't be. We started our search in the basement, where the air was damp and musty. It was dark, our flashlights barely cutting through the thick shadows. As we descended, the whispers began again, a low murmur that seemed to come from the very walls. My heart pounded in my chest, every nerve on edge. We reached an old storage room, filled with broken furniture and decaying books. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. I felt a cold hand brush against my neck and spun around, but there was nothing there. The fear was suffocating, making it hard to breathe, to think. Sarah found an old box in the corner, covered in dust and cobwebs. As she opened it, the whispers stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Inside the box were old, charred bones, wrapped in a tattered piece of cloth. Mira's remains. Ivan said we needed to take the remains to the schoolyard and bury them properly. We wrapped the bones carefully and made our way back upstairs, the silence pressing down on us. As we stepped outside, a cold wind swept through the yard, carrying with it a faint, ghostly wail. We dug a small grave near a tree at the edge of the yard. The ground was hard and unforgiving, but we worked quickly, desperate to be done with it. As we laid the bones in the ground, a sense of relief washed over me. Maybe, just maybe, this would be enough. But as we covered the grave, the ground began to tremble. The whispers returned, louder than ever, and the air grew icy cold. A figure appeared in the shadows, slowly taking shape. It was Mira, her face twisted in anger, her eyes burning with a malevolent fire. "You think this will stop me?" she hissed, her voice echoing in the night. "You took everything from me. You will all suffer." The ground beneath us cracked open, and dark tendrils of smoke curled around our legs, pulling us down. We struggled, but it was like fighting quicksand. The whispers turned into screams, deafening, overwhelming. I felt a searing pain in my chest, like my heart was being squeezed by an invisible hand. Ivan shouted something in Ukrainian, words I didn't understand, and threw a small vial of holy water at Mira. She screamed, a sound that pierced my very soul, and the tendrils loosened their grip. We scrambled to our feet, backing away from the grave. "We need to finish this," Ivan said, his voice trembling. "We need to burn the remains, scatter the ashes. It's the only way." We gathered what little dry wood we could find and built a small pyre over the grave. Ivan poured more holy water over the bones and lit a match. The fire caught quickly, the flames leaping high, casting eerie shadows across the yard. As the bones burned, Mira's screams grew louder, more desperate. The air was thick with the smell of burning flesh and decay. I felt something cold and slimy wrap around my ankle and looked down to see a skeletal hand reaching out from the ground. I kicked it away, my heart racing. The fire burned bright and hot, consuming the bones until there was nothing left but ashes. Ivan scattered them to the wind, chanting in a language I didn't understand. The ground stopped shaking, the whispers faded, and the air grew still. We stood there, exhausted and trembling, hoping it was finally over. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Mira's hatred was too strong, too deep. As we made our way back to the checkpoint, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had only delayed the inevitable. That night, we camped near the edge of the exclusion zone, too tired to make the journey back. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the stars, trying to calm my racing mind. But the whispers returned, faint and distant, a constant reminder that we were never truly free. In the morning, Ivan was gone. His belongings were still there, but he had vanished without a trace. We searched for him, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. It was like he had been swallowed by the darkness. As we made our way back to civilization, a sense of dread settled over us. We had tried to put Mira to rest, but she was still with us, haunting our every step. The fear was a constant companion, a shadow that loomed over us, reminding us of the terrible mistake we had made. We returned to our lives, but nothing was the same. The nightmares continued. The whispers never truly left. We were haunted, broken, and there was no escape. We had awakened something in Chernobyl, something that would never let us go. After returning home, the sense of dread clung to us like a second skin. Sarah, Beth, and I kept in touch, sharing our experiences and trying to make sense of the relentless haunting. The nightmares were constant, the whispers unceasing. Every shadow, every flicker of light seemed like a threat. We were unraveling, and we knew it. One night, About a week after we returned, I woke to the sound of scratching. At first, I thought it was a rat or some other pest, but as I sat up in bed, the sound grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the walls. I pressed my ear to the plaster and heard the whispers again, clearer than ever, as if they were coming from inside the walls themselves. I backed away, heart pounding, and the scratching stopped abruptly. Then, a low, guttural laugh filled the room, sending chills down my spine. I looked around, but there was nothing there, just shadows and the oppressive feeling of being watched. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was my imagination, but the fear was too real, too immediate. I called Sarah and Beth the next day, and they both had similar experiences. Sarah heard footsteps pacing outside her door all night, and Beth found strange symbols scratched into her walls, symbols that hadn't been there before. We were all on edge, barely sleeping, barely functioning. The haunting was intensifying, and we didn't know how much more we could take. A few days later, Beth stopped answering her phone. I drove to her place, fearing the worst. Her apartment was a mess, like she'd left in a hurry. Clothes were strewn everywhere, and the air was thick with the smell of fear and decay. On the walls were more of those strange symbols, etched deep into the plaster. I found her in the bathroom, huddled in the corner, her eyes wide with terror. She was muttering to herself, rocking back and forth. I reached out to her, but she recoiled, screaming about Mira, about how she was coming for us. I managed to calm her down enough to get her to the hospital, but the doctors were baffled. They said it was a psychotic break, but I knew better. Mira was breaking us, one by one. Sarah and I were the only ones left. We met up at a local diner, trying to come up with a plan, but we were running out of options. The whispers followed us everywhere. The shadows seemed to move on their own, and we were both at the end of our ropes. One night, Sarah called me, her voice barely a whisper. "Jake, she's here, in my apartment. I can see her." I drove over as fast as I could, but by the time I got there, it was too late. The door was ajar, and the place was eerily silent. I found Sarah in her bedroom, her eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. She was gone, her face twisted in an expression of pure terror. On the wall above her bed was a message, scratched deep into the paint. "You can't escape." I collapsed to the floor, overwhelmed by grief and fear. Sarah was gone. Beth was in a mental hospital, and Alex and Mike were dead. I was the last one left, and I knew it was only a matter of time before Mira came for me too. I decided to leave, to get as far away from Chernobyl as possible. I packed a bag and booked a flight to a remote part of the country, hoping that distance would somehow sever the connection. But deep down, I knew it was futile. Mira's hatred was too strong, her reach too far. The first night in the new place, I thought I was safe. The house was quiet, the air clear. But then, as I lay in bed, the whispers returned, louder, more insistent than ever. I sat up, heart pounding, and saw her standing at the foot of my bed. Her eyes burned with a malevolent fire, and her face twisted into a hideous grin. "You can't run," she said, her voice a cold, sharp whisper. "You will never be free." The room grew cold, and the shadows seemed to close in around me. I felt a pressure on my chest, like an invisible hand squeezing the life out of me. I gasped for breath, trying to fight it off, but it was no use. The darkness was closing in, suffocating me. In a last desperate act, I grabbed my phone and called Ivan, hoping against hope that he might have some last piece of advice, some way to end this. His voice was distant, crackling through the static. "You must confront her, Jake. Face her. Only then can you hope to end this." I didn't know what else to do. With trembling hands, I lit a candle and sat in the middle of the room, waiting. The whispers grew louder, the shadows darker. Mira appeared again, her form more solid, more terrifying than ever. "You think you can stop me?" she hissed, her voice filled with contempt. "You are nothing." I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice shaking. Her eyes burned with fury. "Vengeance. You took everything from me. You disturbed my rest. Now you will suffer." I didn't know what to say, how to appease her. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I'm so sorry." For a moment, the whispers stopped and the air grew still. Mira's form flickered, and I saw a glimmer of the person she once was. Before the disaster, before the pain. But then the anger returned and she lunged at me, her form dissolving into a cloud of darkness. The pressure on my chest intensified, and I felt myself slipping away. But then, through the haze of fear and pain, I remembered Ivan's words. I had to confront her, to face her head on. Summoning every ounce of courage, I stood up, facing the darkness. "You can't have my life," I shouted, my voice echoing in the room. "I won't let you take it." For a moment, the darkness recoiled, and Mira's form reappeared, her eyes wide with surprise. "You dare defy me?" she screamed. "Yes," I said, my voice steadier now. "I do." The darkness swirled around me, but I stood my ground, refusing to give in. Slowly, the pressure eased, and the whispers faded. Mira's form flickered again, and I saw the pain in her eyes, the deep, soul-crushing sorrow. "I'm sorry," I whispered again, and this time I meant it. "I'm so sorry for what happened to you." For a moment, she looked almost human, her face softening. And then, with a final shuddering sigh, she vanished, the darkness dissipating like smoke. The room was silent, the air clear. I fell to my knees, exhausted but alive. The whispers were gone, and the shadows no longer moved on their own. I knew it wasn't truly over, that the memory of what happened would haunt me for the rest of my life. But for now, the terror was over. Mira was gone, and I was free. I packed up my things and left the house, determined to start fresh, to put as much distance between me and Chernobyl as possible. But no matter where I went, the memory of that place, of what we had unleashed, would always be with me. Even after confronting Mira, the sense of unease never fully left me. I moved to a small town far away from anything familiar, hoping to leave the horrors of Chernobyl behind. Life was quiet, almost peaceful for a while, but the shadows of my past loomed ever present. It was about 6 months after that final confrontation when I first noticed the signs. A cold breeze in a sealed room, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks, remnants of trauma. But deep down, I knew better. You can't escape something that has been woken from a place like Chernobyl. One night, I was sitting in my small, dimly lit apartment, trying to read and distract myself. The whispers returned, faint at first, like a distant echo. My heart sank. I closed the book and listened, hoping it was just my imagination. But then, they grew louder, more distinct. The same chilling murmur that haunted me for months. I stood up, my body tense with fear, and walked to the window. Outside, the street was empty, the night unnaturally still. As I turned away, I caught a glimpse of a figure in the glass. Mira, standing behind me, her eyes burning with the same vengeful fire. I spun around, but she was gone. The room was empty, yet the air was thick with her presence. I knew then that this wasn't over. Mira's spirit was still tied to me, her hatred too deep to be quelled by mere confrontation. I decided to call Ivan, the only person who might understand. His phone rang endlessly before going to voicemail. I left a frantic message, explaining what was happening, begging for his help. Days turned into weeks, and the haunting grew worse. I saw Mira everywhere, in mirrors, reflections, even in my dreams. She never spoke, just watched with those piercing eyes, a silent reminder of my trespass. I became a prisoner in my own home, afraid to leave, afraid to stay. One night, the whispers became screams. They filled my apartment, echoing off the walls, suffocating me with their intensity. I tried to block them out, covering my ears, but it was useless. Then, Mira appeared, her form more solid, more terrifying than ever. She reached out, her fingers like ice, and touched my forehead. A searing pain shot through my skull, and I collapsed to the floor, writhing in agony. Images flooded my mind, Scenes of Chernobyl, of death and suffering, of Mira's final moments. I saw her trapped in the school, the flames consuming her, her screams merging with those of the other victims. The pain was unbearable, a torrent of torment that seemed to last an eternity. When it finally ended, I was left trembling on the floor, drenched in sweat. Mira stood over me, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "You will never escape," she whispered. "You will suffer as I have suffered." I knew then that there was only one way to end this, to return to Chernobyl, to face her on her own ground. It was a desperate, dangerous plan, but I had no other choice. I booked a flight and made my way back to that cursed place, hoping against hope that I could find a way to end this once and for all. I arrived at the exclusion zone, my heart heavy with dread. The air was thick with the same oppressive silence, the buildings standing like tombstones in a forgotten graveyard. I made my way to the school, the site of our initial folly, each step filled with a sense of impending doom. Inside, the place was just as I remembered, decayed, lifeless, haunted. I walked through the halls, the whispers following me, guiding me to the basement where we had found Mira's remains. The air grew colder, the darkness deeper. I reached the storage room, the place where it all began. I stood in the center of the room, the silence pressing in around me. "Mira!" I called out, my voice echoing off the walls. "I'm here. I'm ready to end this." For a moment, there was nothing. Then the air shimmered, and Mira appeared, her form wavering like a ghostly flame. Her eyes were filled with the same hatred, the same unending sorrow. "You cannot escape," she said, her voice a cold whisper. "You will pay for what you have done." "I know," I replied, my voice trembling. "But this has to end. You deserve peace. We both do." She reached out, her hand passing through me like a cold breeze. The pain returned, a sharp, searing agony that drove me to my knees. But I didn't resist. I let it wash over me, accepting it, understanding it. I saw her life, her death, her pain. I saw the lives lost in Chernobyl, the suffering, the despair. As the pain subsided, I looked up at Mira, tears streaming down my face. "I'm sorry," I whispered, "for everything." Her form flickered, and for a moment I saw the girl she once was. Before the disaster, before the hatred, her eyes softened, the fire dimming. She reached out again, but this time there was no pain, only a profound sadness. "Rest," I said, my voice breaking. "Find peace." She nodded slowly, her form dissolving into the air, the darkness lifting. The whispers faded, replaced by a deep, eerie silence. I knew then that she was gone, that the haunting was finally over. I left Chernobyl, my heart heavy with the weight of what had happened. The journey back was a blur, my mind filled with the memories of that terrible place. But as I stepped off the plane, I felt a strange sense of relief. The shadows were gone, the whispers silenced. I was free. I moved to a new town, far away from the memories of Chernobyl, and tried to rebuild my life. The nightmares still come sometimes, but they're different now. Not of terror, but of sorrow. A reminder of the lives lost, of the pain that lingers. I know I'll never truly escape the memory of what happened, the haunting of Chernobyl, but I found a way to live with it, to accept it, and in that acceptance, I found a measure of peace. I called my aunt with the Ouija board. She exposed all my family grousamy secrets. "Hey Reddit, I need to share something that's been eating me alive. This is no joke, and I'm not writing for attention. I'm writing because I don't know what else to do. I need to get this off my chest." It all started when my aunt passed away. She was my favourite relative, the fun aunt who always seemed to know a bit more than everyone else. She was into all sorts of weird stuff. Crystals, tarot cards. And, as I found out later, Ouija boards. When she died, she left me her collection of occult items, including her favourite Ouija board. At first, I didn't think much of it. I mean, it was just a piece of wood with letters on it, right? One night, I was feeling particularly low. Family drama, work stress, you name it. I was dealing with it. I remembered the Ouija board and thought, what the hell, let's see if this thing actually works. So, I set it up in my room, lit a few candles, and started asking questions. Stupid stuff at first, like, is anyone here? And, can you show me a sign? Nothing happened for the first few minutes, and I felt like a complete idiot. But then, the planchette started to move. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. It was slow, deliberate. It spelled out Hello. My heart raced. Was this real? I asked for a name, and it spelled out Annie. My aunt's name was Annabelle, but everyone called her Annie. I was skeptical, but also freaked out. I asked, is this really you, Aunt Annie? The planchette slid to yes. I asked her if she was okay, if she was at peace. She said no. That's when I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I asked why, and she started spelling out words that made my blood run cold. Secrets. What secrets? I asked, my voice trembling. She spelled out Family. I didn't know what to make of it. Our family wasn't perfect, but whose is? I asked her to be more specific, and that's when things got really dark. She spelled out Basement. Our family home has a basement that my parents always kept locked. As kids, we were told never to go down there. It was unsafe, they said. I never questioned it, but now my aunt was telling me that the answers were down there. I asked her what I would find, and she spelled out one word, Truth. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about the basement, about what my aunt had said. The next day, I went to my parents' house while they were out. I found the key to the basement hidden in my dad's study, just where he always hid things he didn't want us to find. I stood at the top of the stairs, staring into the darkness below. The air was musty and cold, and every fibre of my being told me to turn back. But I couldn't. I had to know. I walked down the creaky stairs, the light from my phone barely cutting through the gloom. The basement was filled with old furniture, boxes, and other junk. But in the far corner, I saw something that didn't belong. A small, locked chest. My heart pounded as I approached it. I tried the key, and to my surprise, it fit perfectly. What I found inside made me wish I had never opened it. There were old photographs, letters, and documents that painted a picture of my family I had never imagined. My grandfather, who I'd always been told died of natural causes, had actually killed himself after being accused of molesting my aunt when she was a child. My father had been the one to find him, hanging from a beam in this very basement. There were letters from my aunt to my father, begging him to believe her, to protect her, but he had dismissed her as being troubled and sent her away to a mental institution. She had spent years there, her pleas for help ignored by everyone, including my grandmother, who wrote cruel, dismissive letters in response. I felt sick to my stomach. I wanted to run, to pretend I'd never seen any of it, but I couldn't. I sat there in the darkness, reading through the horrifying history of my family. My aunt had been trying to protect me, to warn me, and now, through the Ouija board, she had finally succeeded. I wish I could say that was the end of it, but things only got worse from there. My aunt's messages became more urgent, more desperate. She started spelling out names, my cousins, my siblings. She was trying to warn me about something happening now, not just in the past. I couldn't stop thinking about the basement, about the chest and the horrifying secrets it held. My mind raced with questions, but one thing was clear. My family wasn't what I thought it was. My aunt's spirit was reaching out for a reason, and I had to find out why. The Ouija board was the only way I knew how to communicate with her, so I set it up again the next night. This time, I was more prepared. I had my questions lined up, ready to ask. As soon as the planchette started moving, I asked, Aunt Annie, what do I need to know about our family now? The answer came quickly. Danger. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. What kind of danger? I asked. The planchette spelled out Sister. My sister, Emily. She was only 16, still living at home. I immediately felt a surge of protectiveness. What's happening to Emily? I demanded. The response was slow, deliberate. SAME. I felt my heart drop. Was she saying that Emily was going through the same horrors she had? I had to know more. Who is hurting her? I asked. The planchette moved quickly. DAD. I recoiled, feeling like I had been punched in the gut. My dad? No, it couldn't be. He was strict and sometimes harsh, but he wouldn't. Would he? I had to be sure. I asked the board, "Are you certain?" The planchette didn't move for what felt like an eternity. Then it spelled out YES. My mind was spinning. I couldn't breathe. If this was true, Emily was in immediate danger. I had to do something. But what? I decided to confront my dad the next day. I couldn't just accuse him without proof, but I needed to see his reaction. The next morning, I drove to my parents' house. My dad was in the garage, tinkering with his tools like he always did on weekends. I walked up to him, trying to keep my voice steady. "Dad, we need to talk." He looked up, frowning. "What about?" I took a deep breath. "About Emily. Is there something you need to tell me?" His face went pale, and for a moment I saw a flash of something in his eyes. Fear, maybe guilt. But then it was gone, replaced by anger. "What are you talking about?" "I know about Aunt Annie," I said, my voice shaking. "I know what happened to her, what Grandpa did, and I know you're doing the same thing to Emily." He dropped the wrench he was holding, his face contorting in rage. "You don't know anything," he spat. "Stay out of this. It's none of your business." "None of my business?" I shouted. "She's my sister." He lunged at me, his hands closing around my throat. I fought back, kicking and struggling. He was stronger, but I was younger and fueled by adrenaline. I managed to break free and ran into the house, locking the door behind me. My mum came rushing in, demanding to know what was going on. I told her everything, but she just stood there, stunned and disbelieving. My dad started pounding on the door, shouting for me to come out. My mum finally snapped out of her shock and called the police. They arrived quickly, and my dad was arrested. Emily was taken to the hospital, where doctors confirmed the abuse. She had been too scared to tell anyone, just like Aunt Annie. The house was quiet that night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. I set up the Ouija board one last time. "Aunt Annie," I asked, "is there anything else I need to know?" The planchette moved slowly, almost hesitantly. It spelled out MORE. My stomach turned. "More what?" I asked. CHILDREN, it spelled out. I felt a chill run down my spine. Were there more victims? More secrets hidden in the shadows of my family's past? Before I could ask any more questions, the candles flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. I felt a cold breeze, and then I heard it, a whisper in my ear, soft and chilling. "Protect them." I knew then that this wasn't just about my family. It was about all the children who had suffered, and all those who might still be in danger. I had to keep going, had to uncover every last secret, no matter how horrifying. I couldn't let this cycle of abuse continue. I'll be back with more updates, but for now, I need to gather my thoughts and figure out my next move. This is far from over. Stay safe, everyone, and keep your loved ones close. You never know what darkness might be lurking in your own home. With my father behind bars and the trafficking ring exposed, I thought the nightmare was over. I was wrong. The darkness that had plagued my family for generations was far from done with me. My sister Emily had been placed in a safe house while the authorities figured out what to do next. She was traumatized, barely speaking, and constantly looking over her shoulder. I spent every moment I could with her, trying to reassure her that the worst was behind us. But deep down, I knew something still lingered. One night, Emily woke up screaming. When I rushed to her side, she was drenched in sweat, her eyes wild with fear. "He's coming for me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He's coming." "Who?" I asked, holding her tightly. "Who's coming for you?" She looked at me with tears streaming down her face. "Grandpa." My heart skipped a beat. Grandpa was dead. He had been for years. But something in Emily's eyes told me she believed it. I decided to use the Ouija board again, desperate for answers. As I set it up, Emily watched from the corner of the room, clutching a blanket. I placed my fingers on the planchette and asked, "Aunt Annie, is Grandpa's spirit haunting Emily?" The planchette moved slowly, spelling out YES. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. "Why?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. TRUTH, it spelled out. "What truth?" I demanded, my frustration growing. "What more do I need to know?" The planchette spelled out EVIL. My breath caught in my throat. "What do you mean by evil?" DEMON, it replied. I stared at the board in disbelief. A demon? Was this some kind of sick joke? But I knew better than to doubt the messages from the board. It had been right about everything so far. I needed more information. I decided to visit my grandmother, who was living in a nursing home. She had been estranged from the family after Grandpa's death, and I hadn't seen her in years. When I arrived, she looked frail and distant, her eyes cloudy with age. "Grandma, I need to talk to you about Grandpa," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Her eyes sharpened at the mention of his name. "Why would you bring him up?" she asked, her voice tinged with fear. "Because he's not resting," I replied. "He's haunting Emily. I need to know why." She hesitated, her hands trembling. "He was a monster," she whispered. "What he did to your aunt, it was just the beginning. He was involved in dark rituals, trying to summon something evil." I felt a lump in my throat. "What kind of rituals?" She closed her eyes as if trying to block out the memories. "He was trying to summon a demon, to gain power and control. He believed it would make him invincible. But something went wrong. The demon didn't possess him. It lingered, infecting our family." My blood ran cold. This wasn't just about my father's crimes. This was something far darker, something supernatural that had been festering in our family for generations. "What can I do?" I asked, desperate for a solution. "There's an old journal," she said, her voice barely audible. "It's hidden in the attic of the family house. It contains the rituals, the incantations. Maybe it can help you understand." I thanked her and left, my mind racing. I had to find that journal. When I got back to the family house, I went straight to the attic. It was filled with dust and cobwebs, the air thick with neglect. After searching through old trunks and boxes, I found it. A leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. As I read through it, my horror grew. The rituals described were grotesque, involving sacrifices and blood. There were drawings of symbols and detailed instructions on how to summon and control the demon. But there were also notes about how to banish it, how to break its hold on the family. I decided to try one of the banishment rituals. That night, I gathered the necessary items, candles, salt, and a few herbs. Emily watched nervously as I set everything up. I explained to her what I was doing, trying to reassure her that this would make everything better. We sat in a circle, the candles casting flickering shadows on the walls. I began to chant the incantation from the journal, my voice steady but filled with determination. As I spoke the final words, a cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing the candles. Emily screamed, and I felt a presence, dark and oppressive, closing in on us. But I didn't stop. I continued the chant, louder and more forceful. The wind grew stronger, and I felt a pressure in my chest, as if something was trying to crush me. But I pushed through, repeating the words over and over. Suddenly, the wind stopped. The air became still, and the oppressive presence lifted. I opened my eyes and saw Emily looking around, her fear replaced with a tentative hope. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I think so," I replied, though I wasn't entirely sure. We spent the night in the living room, too scared to go to bed. But as the hours passed, nothing happened. The house was quiet, almost peaceful. It seemed the ritual had worked. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of relief. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. The journal hinted at other secrets, other dark forces that might still be lurking. My family's history was tainted, and I had a feeling there was more to uncover. I had to be vigilant, had to protect Emily and anyone else who might be affected. I'll continue to dig, to uncover the truth, no matter how horrifying it might be. This darkness has plagued my family for too long, and it's time to bring it to light. For now, though, we have a moment of peace, but I'll be ready for whatever comes next. The fight isn't over, and I won't stop until it is. Despite the momentary peace, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still terribly wrong. My aunt's whispers seemed to echo in my mind, urging me to continue digging, to uncover every last dark secret. One evening, as I was sorting through the attic, I found an old photo album. It was filled with pictures of family gatherings, vacations, and celebrations. But one photo stood out. It was of my grandmother when she was young, standing next to a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, with an unsettling smile, and his eyes seemed to pierce through the photograph. On the back, in faded ink, was written, Uncle Joseph. I had never heard of an Uncle Joseph. I decided to ask my grandmother about him during my next visit to the nursing home. When I showed her the photo, her face went pale. She reached out with a trembling hand and took the photo from me, staring at it for a long moment before speaking. "Joseph was my brother," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We don't talk about him because he disappeared when I was a child. My parents told me he ran away, but I always felt there was more to the story." I pressed her for more details, but she seemed reluctant to speak. After some coaxing, she finally opened up. "Joseph was different," she said. "He was always interested in dark things, black magic, the occult. He would disappear for days, sometimes weeks, and when he returned, he seemed changed, darker somehow. Then one day, he vanished for good. I asked if she had any idea where he might have gone, but she shook her head. "I don't know, and to be honest, I don't want to know. But if you're determined to find out, check the old cabin in the woods. That was his hideout. Maybe you'll find some answers there." The next day, I drove out to the cabin. It was a long-forgotten place, hidden deep in the forest. The air was thick with the scent of pine and decay as I approached the dilapidated structure. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, revealing a dark and dusty interior. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and the floorboards groaned under my weight. I started searching through the cabin, and it didn't take long to find what I was looking for. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard was a small chest. Inside were old, yellowed pages covered in strange symbols and writing, similar to the ones in my grandfather's journal. There was also a photograph of Joseph, older now, standing in front of a large, imposing house. On the back was written an address. The house in the photograph was in a nearby town, so I decided to check it out. As I drove there, an uneasy feeling settled in my gut. The address led me to a large Victorian-style mansion, its windows dark and lifeless. The place looked abandoned, but something about it felt wrong, like a presence was watching me. I forced myself to go inside. The interior was as decrepit as the exterior, with peeling wallpaper and broken furniture. The air was heavy, oppressive. I felt like I was being suffocated by the very walls. I explored room by room, finding nothing but dust and decay. But then I reached the basement. The basement door was ajar, and as I descended the steps, a foul odour hit me. It was the smell of rot and something else, something unnatural. The basement was dark, but I could see faint symbols drawn on the walls, glowing with a sickly green light. In the centre of the room was a large wooden table covered in old, dried blood. I felt a wave of nausea. This was no ordinary basement. It was a ritual chamber. I saw more books and papers scattered around, all filled with the same strange symbols. As I picked up one of the books, I heard a low, guttural growl behind me. I spun around, but saw nothing. I decided I had seen enough and hurried back up the stairs. But as I reached the top, the door slammed shut, trapping me in darkness. Panic set in as I pounded on the door, trying to force it open. Then I heard it, a whisper, soft and chilling, right in my ear. "Leave." I turned, and there, in the darkness, I saw a figure. It was Uncle Joseph, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light, his face twisted in a malicious grin. He reached out for me, and I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. "Leave now," he hissed. With a surge of adrenaline, I kicked the door open and ran to my car. I didn't stop until I was miles away from that cursed house. When I finally pulled over, my hands were shaking, my heart racing. I knew then that my family's history was far darker than I had ever imagined. Uncle Joseph's disappearance, the demonic rituals, the abuse, it was all connected. And the presence I felt, the malevolent force that seemed to haunt my every step, was still out there, waiting. I have to dig deeper, uncover every last secret, no matter the cost. My family's souls, including Emily's, depend on it. This fight is far from over. There's more darkness to confront, more evil to banish. I just hope I'm strong enough to face it. The drive back home felt like a blur. My mind was racing, filled with the horrific images of what I had discovered. Uncle Joseph's sinister grin haunted me, his words echoing in my ears. I knew I had to end this, to confront the evil that had plagued my family for generations. When I got home, Emily was waiting for me. She looked at me with wide, fearful eyes, and I knew I couldn't hide the truth from her any longer. I sat her down and told her everything about Uncle Joseph, the demonic rituals, and the presence I had felt in that house. She listened in silence, her face pale, but she didn't look away. "We have to end this," I said, my voice trembling. "We need to banish whatever is haunting us once and for all." Emily nodded, her jaw set with determination. "What do we need to do?" I took out the journal and the pages I had found in the cabin. The rituals for summoning and banishing were complex, but we had no other choice. We gathered everything we needed: candles, herbs, salt, and a few personal items from our family members, living and dead. The ritual had to be performed in the place where the darkness was strongest, the basement of the old family house. We arrived at the house just as the sun was setting. The place looked even more foreboding in the dim light, shadows creeping across the walls like dark, twisted fingers. We set up the candles in a circle in the basement, the air thick with the scent of sage and rosemary. The symbols on the walls seemed to pulse with a faint, eerie glow as we began the incantation. As we chanted, the temperature in the room dropped, our breaths visible in the cold air. I felt a presence, a heavy, oppressive force that seemed to close in around us. Emily's voice wavered, but I squeezed her hand, urging her to continue. The words flowed from my lips, the ancient language foreign yet strangely familiar. Suddenly, the candles flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. A low growl echoed through the basement, and I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. I turned, and there he was, Uncle Joseph, his eyes glowing with malevolent light, his face contorted in a grotesque smile. "You can't stop me," he hissed, his voice dripping with venom. "I've waited too long for this." I stepped forward, holding the journal in one hand, the other clutching a piece of my grandfather's old jacket. "You're wrong," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "This ends now." With a surge of determination, I continued the incantation, my voice rising above the growls and whispers that filled the room. Emily joined in, her voice steady and clear. The symbols on the walls flared with light, and I felt a pulse of energy radiate from the circle. Joseph screamed, a sound that echoed through the house, filled with rage and despair. His form began to waver, the glow in his eyes flickering. "No!" he shrieked, lunging at us. But he was too late. The final words of the banishment ritual left my lips, and a blinding light filled the room. When the light faded, the basement was silent. Joseph was gone, his presence erased. The oppressive force that had weighed on us lifted, replaced by a sense of calm and peace. I fell to my knees, tears streaming down my face. Emily knelt beside me, her hand on my shoulder. "It's over," she whispered, her voice filled with relief. "We did it." We stayed there for a while, letting the reality of what we had done sink in. The darkness that had haunted our family for generations was finally gone. The basement, once a place of horror, felt different, cleansed, free. In the days that followed, things slowly began to return to normal. Emily started to smile again, the shadows in her eyes fading. The authorities continued their investigation into the trafficking ring, bringing justice to those who had suffered. My father remained in prison, but I knew he would never haunt us again. I still keep the journal, a reminder of the darkness we faced and the strength we found to overcome it. My aunt's spirit has found peace, and so have we. The secrets of our family, once buried and festering, have been brought to light, and with them, the evil has been banished. But I will never forget the lessons I've learned. Darkness can hide in the most unexpected places, even within those we love. It's our duty to uncover it, to fight it, no matter the cost. For now, we have found peace, but I will always be vigilant, ready to face whatever comes next.